This podcast is brought to you by the Resolve Long Horizon Investing Masterclass, a 10-part evergreen podcast series where Adam Butler, Mike Philbrick, and Rodrigo Gordillo of Resolve Asset Management Global explore an advanced investment framework specifically designed to steward quasi-permanent capital with humility and balance. From the science of decision-making to all-weather portfolio construction to the value of diversified alpha and tail protection, this series provides a comprehensive capital management roadmap to improve outcomes for wealthy individuals, advisors, family offices, and institutions managing less than $10 billion. To listen to the series or read the transcripts on demand, please visit investresolve.com/masterclass. Alternatively, you can find it on your favorite podcast player by searching for Resolve-Masterclass.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Happy Friday, guys.
Cheers.
Hi.
It just goes that
Cheers.
way. Cheers in the middle.
Cheers.
Larry, welcome.
Thank
Cheers. What are you drinking? That's a rum and Coke, right, Larry?
It's a coffee and coffee.
Oh, okay. Coffee. Where are you that coffee is not, this is not late in the day for coffee?
I am in Chicago, but my head is on California time.
Ah, that
and
makes
I
sense.
live
That
out there
makes
in the
sense.
winter, and I'm going there in a few weeks. So
Gotcha.
coffee is the stuff for me.
Mike is going to do a bit of a disclaimer. Go ahead, bud.
Oh, yeah. So just as a reminder to everyone listening on a Friday afternoon, this is for entertainment purposes only, and it is not to be taken as investment advice of any kind. It's not to be taken as advice of any kind. So if you would like advice on something, go get a professional, not four scallywags on YouTube having 3 drinks and a coffee. And with that, we can really let loose and have a chat. Precise.
That's the kind of formal disclaimers that we like at Resolve, I'll tell you.
Quick,
Larry, thank you so. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Just for those who don't know, Larry is research director, right, for the CFA Institute. How long have you been doing that? Because I think you have been in that role for quite a while. You're sort of an institution there.
Well, since 2005, but it's part-time, and I was at the Ford Foundation as their head of research until 2009. So I overlapped. And I also am the research director, not for the Institute, but for the CFA Institute Research Foundation, which is an independently governed organization that commissions monographs, which are books, and briefs, which are articles. And we are independent in that we don't just serve the needs of the CFA Institute and its members, but the general public and our researchers, the people that Bud and I give grants to. It's like a university. They're supposed to follow the research wherever it takes them, and we don't tell them what to do.
So do you play a role then in vetting and choosing articles for the Financial Analyst Journal then? Is that one of the...
I did. I was on their advisory board, and I termed out after 12 years. So now I play a role, as I have since the late 80s or early 90s, in choosing articles for the Journal of Portfolio Management and the Journal of Investing, which are a different organization. Those are unpaid jobs that you do for fun and to keep your name in the papers.
Do you also participate? Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to understand, because I follow the CFA Institute curriculum quite closely, and I noticed that it changes quite a bit every year, and it does try to keep up with the most recent trends in the industry, particularly after the 08-09 period. Mortgage-backed securities and stuff like that became very prominent in the curriculum, and then more recently, the blockchain revolution has also featured prominently. Are you part of that decision to sort of curate the content that would be eligible to be added to the curriculum?
No, my responsibilities are really to the Research Foundation only, and it's to get books and articles selected, then curated in the sense that I edit the books and published. And we are quite separate from the CFA Institute's education. I don't really know what is in the curriculum at this time.
Neither do I, but Richard has just been through the curriculum recently, right? What is it? Was it 2 years ago, Richard? 3 years ago?
No, it was actually closer to 7, but thanks
7 years ago. Man, time flies.
Yeah, made me feel a little younger there. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm also not a CFA charter holder. When I joined the Ford Foundation, one of the requirements was to either sit for the exams or already have passed them. But I'm so old that I was exempt because I had an MBA from the University of Chicago in finance, and that was considered to be even better. We had 11 Nobel Prize winners. The Nobel Prize is yet to come on the faculty. So at various times, not all at once. So we would have classes. We were a bunch of 22, 23-year-olds, and we'd have classes where the professors would be handing out mimeographed papers, and those would later win Nobel Prizes. But we didn't know that at the time. We just thought that they were something the professor wanted us to read, so they typed it up.
Yeah, well,
Fantastic.
Much of the seminal research that is covered in the CFA curriculum, I know, is informed by or motivated by a lot of the research that comes out of University of Chicago. So I'm sure you have an intimate understanding of a lot of the core subject matter. And then also you've got, I guess, and this is something that you're, I think, probably most excited about at the moment, this project where you've written a book called Fewer, Richer, Greener: Prospects for Humanity in an Age of Abundance. And I will warn you that on RIFs, we have tended to skew a little bit pessimistic. We had Steve Keen on the podcast, I don't know if it was 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, who's calling for a climate collapse and the end of capitalism in the next 10 years. So this will be a breath of fresh air for many viewers of RIFs. And so we're looking forward to adding a little optimism to our repertoire.
Well, we're not going to have an end to capitalism, and the climate is changing, and this presents real risks that I shouldn't minimize, but it's happened before, right? My ancestors, who were Jewish, came here partly because of religious persecution, but also for the same reason that non-Jews came here from Europe, which is that Europe was going through a little ice age between, say, 1600 and 1880. And food was becoming scarce in the northern parts, Germany, so Netherlands and so forth, and England. And things were better here. So we've faced much worse problems in the past. We didn't have the technology. We didn't have airplanes, weather satellites, instantaneous communication, cheap, not free, but fairly cheap transportation. And so we're going to rise to these challenges. And I'd like to start by saying that the why I wrote the book and then what happened with COVID. But children were coming home and telling their parents, why did you have me when the earth is going to be a rotating cinder before I'm a mature adult? And of course, it's not true, but that's what children are being taught, and they believe it. I mean, you look up to your teachers, and what is true is that we face a different set of challenges than we did in the past when we had to get our kids through plague, smallpox, polio, World Wars I and II, and the Great Depression. Now, compared to that, these challenges are fairly moderate, but they're not non-existent. About 200 million people out of the 7 or 8 billion people in the world live in areas that are threatened by rising water levels. But 200 million people move internationally every year. So we're basically that's 1 year's international migration extra that we have to deal with. We have, let me just share my screen. And
yeah, that's great.
I believe this will work. Somebody has to.
Yeah, we see it.
Tell me how to do it. Thank you. And then as I change what's on the screen, that's right. You can see the little guy.
Yep.
Yes. The Little Prince, is he?
Yeah.
The first thing I wanted to mention is that the population explosion is almost over. When we were all going to die because we were going to populate ourselves off the earth. We'd all be starving. There'd be 15 billion people on Earth by now, and 3 trillion by the end of the next century. And we all read The Limits to Growth in high school, read about it. And none of it's true. What happened was that people adjust to changing incentives. It's now much more fruitful to have fewer children and invest more in each one of them than to have a lot of children and hope that a few of them live to be able to work on the farm and support you in your old age. So all around the world, the population explosion is coming to an end. In Africa, it's less than in the rest of the world, but I'll get to that. By the way, this poor guy, we're not going to get down to one person. There's been a lot of talk now that we're having too few children and the population is going to shrink too fast. I'm not all that excited about that either. I think that incentives will change yet again. If there aren't enough children, people will respond by having more of them, but there's no actual guarantee of that. So if you look at this hockey stick that everybody is familiar with, the population of the world began to take off really in this period around 1800, and the big growth was in the 20th century. But let's look at it in log scale. What happened was that between 1900 and about 1975 to 1985, we had this hypergrowth phase, and then as all exponential growth does, because nothing grows forever, it began to slow, and it slowed, but not stopped. And the question is, where does it stop? Does it ever stop? And let's see what's actually happening here. What I had said was that Africa is now on the path, but not very far along the path, that Asia was a third of a century ago. I hope that Africa develops at that pace. I don't think it will, because Asia had a kind of a substrate of what was very, very poor in the middle of the last century. It had China and Japan in particular, but also to some extent India, had histories of having been developed in the distant past, and so they had more human capital. Africa is developing very nicely from a very low level. That is going to take a while, and by the end of this century, African incomes should be, they'll still be the lowest in the world, but should be in the middle income category, which is really my goal for the world. Not that I run the zoo, but if everyone in the world has the opportunity to live a middle class or at least lower middle class life, then economic development has achieved its purpose. Now, I was going to talk before going into this section on incomes about what happened with COVID and what happened to my book. The book sold very well for the first few months, and it was kind of a high point in our own economic development. We were in a boom period. And when COVID hit, literally nobody wanted to hear an optimistic, futuristic talk. The future went back to we're all going to die. And along the way, we're going to get very poor. And what happened was pretty bad. And once in a while, the arrow of economic progress turns around and runs the wrong way. And it really was awful in the spring of 2020. But we had a collapse comparable to 1929 in output. And the stock market fell faster than it had ever fallen. But it did not last long. And partly because of central bank action, but partly because the market reacted to low prices, by sellers turning around and becoming buyers. We had a V-shaped recovery in the markets, and later a V-shaped recovery in the real economy. And unbelievably, TSA throughput, I guess is the word they use, it is back to something like 90% of its 2019 level, without any business travel at all. Restaurants are 60 or 70%. So we're experiencing a very powerful recovery, simply because people want to live the way they did before COVID, and can't quite. We walk around with masks in some areas. We walk around, hopefully, with vaccines. I'll get off my soapbox, but this thing would have been all over by April if we had all gotten our vaccine, because you don't have to have 100%. The disease dies out when you reach herd immunity. But the economy's okay anyway, and we're experiencing something that we haven't had in decades, which is a critical labor shortage. I was served breakfast by the owner of the breakfast place the other day. I don't think he's even been in the building until COVID. He was just sitting in his beach house getting rich. But they have no workers, and so he's the worker. And then we see that everywhere. Help wanted signs, $16 an hour and up, when it was $9 an hour.
Well, where have all the workers gone? Are they just sitting at home with their stipend checks?
That's part of it. I don't know. First of all, in states where the stipend checks have been smaller or have ended entirely, that the labor shortage is less severe, but it is still severe. So where have they gone? I
have a hypothesis in the spirit of, discussion and debate.
Yeah, go for it.
It seems to me that the labor shortages are mostly in service industries, and they tend to be in major urban centers.
Yeah.
And the other thing we're observing in major urban centers is an explosion higher in home prices and increasingly rents. And my observation is that the rents are now so high in many major urban centers that the wages required to support basic living standards for service sector employees are, they're just not able to support the required rents. And so you've got service sector employees leaving major urban centers to find accommodations that they can afford.
So,
but this trend,
I would buy that for a minute, but I happen to own a cheese factory called Upper Canada Cheese in Jordan Station, in the middle of the heart of rural Niagara, and we are experiencing extreme job shortages and having to increase wages by 20 to 40% in order to keep people.
Has there not been a major uptick in home prices in that region in Niagara, though?
Niagara, well, there has been, but it's pervasive. It's across the whole service industry. Like there's not anywhere that hasn't had a rise in home prices. How far away from Toronto do you want to go? There's nowhere that hasn't had
and it's not a recent phenomenon, right?
You need to go a long way.
And
what's not a recent phenomenon?
You need to go to North Bay.
The rise in home
which
prices,
is not what people are going to do. So I'm just wondering where the workers went, because in the rural areas, just outside of Toronto, as an anecdotal example, but it's pervasive across the whole region, you can't get anybody at minimum wage anymore. I have some people who own Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons in North Bay is no better off than Tim Hortons in Toronto. Unfortunately,
really,
this is where I'm.
But if you're already in North Bay and you don't have any, you don't have a job, where are you going to go? So I don't know what the minimum wage is in Ontario, but it can't be enough to live on in Toronto. But you're saying it's not enough to live on in North Bay either.
Well, the home prices in North Bay are up 42% year over year.
Right.
So
Right, but this
that is
trend
a
in home
massive
prices,
shock.
Adam, this rise in home prices has been occurring for, call it the last decade on a yearly basis. I think the crucial variable here that is different this year is the fiscal support in Canada through CERB and in the
Nonsense.
US through.
Completely disagree.
You think that has no basis, no foundation to keep people at home and to raise their opportunity costs to some extent?
I think it would work the other way. You want when prices go up, you need more money. So if you just go on strike and say, "Well, I'm going to wait for $33 an hour," your employer doesn't have it, so you're not going to get it. And that's, by the way, that's about the reservation wage for service workers in high cost areas. And my rent in San Diego, which is a beach house, doubled this year. It's not 40%; it's 105 or something.
Yep. Absolutely.
But so I talked to the guy that owns the breakfast joint, and I said, well, if you're making $16 an hour, which is, it's not the minimum wage there, but it's about the minimum wage. And they're not coming in, what would it take to get them to come in? He said it's about double. It's about $30 to $33 an hour because the government benefits come with health care, which is worth $7 or $8 an hour. And if you're working as an employee, you lose that. You have to pay it yourself. The employer may buy it for you, but then they're going to deduct it.
Oh, well, that completely changes the math. I had no idea that you got health benefits with government.
You go on Medicaid
distributions.
Right.
On top of an eviction moratorium, which has been in place and is now being challenged. So
right.
The only difference recently has been COVID, the lockdowns, and then the subsequent support. Because if your hypothesis were to hold water, Adam, why wouldn't this have occurred earlier throughout the rally in home prices?
Well, there's a few dynamics, right? One is the marginal cost of living has gone up, like for rent anyways, has gone up by between 40% in many urban markets to 100% in many sort of vacation markets or rural markets, whatever, right? And
in places that are nice, it's closer to 100, but the average is probably more like 20 to 40.
Yeah, so you've got a massive shock, right? People were living at the margin before. They were, they had never really considered, am I going to move? You're in the rat race. You're going to work every day. You're barely making ends meet. And then you've got everything goes on pause. And so now you're sort of considering, right. My rent's going up. Like I'm staring in the face of the fact that I can't afford to live in this place anymore. So now I'm looking around, where am I going to live and what am I going to do? You're checking all your premises. You're making different choices. And at the same time, the cost of living is going up, right? So there's obviously a variety of different forces at play.
It's a multivariate problem, of course. It's not just the single thrust of home prices rising that is dictating the move away from major urban areas.
Well, yeah, I don't know what a 40% 1 year shock higher in cost of living would have done in non-COVID times. I'm pretty sure it would have motivated pretty substantial.
Where are they going? I still don't understand. Because in Saskatchewan, the Midwest has the lowest unemployment rate. I don't get, they're not, it's pervasive.
Are we experiencing these types of issues?
The rise in wages is, it's pervasive across the country. That we're having inflation in Canada anyway, and rising wage prices, but the real wages of employees is not going anywhere.
It's not.
It's going slightly down, actually.
Yes.
In real terms, yeah.
Well, I live in a different country, but we're experiencing the exact same thing.
Right. So
it's not our policies. It's something going on in the real economy under the surface. And first of all, I've had a big concern for a very long time that minimum wage and close to minimum wage employees are actually overpaid. That they're hired because you don't. They're zero marginal product or negative marginal product employees, that they're actually destroying your business through incompetence and inability to operate the machines or whatever. But you hire them.
Should we put them through the meat grinder? What's the solution there?
Well, I don't know. They may wind up with some sort of a broader social welfare system of something more like a negative income tax. But the incentives there are also scary. But I think the reason why they're still at work, or we're still at work, is because they used to be useful. And labor markets are very stable. When you hire somebody, as David Autar said, if you get a job changing tires when you're 18, you may still be changing tires when you're 65. So
unless there's a phase shift in technology and in the labor market. So I think this is a great point.
That tires begin to change themselves. That's right.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where I kind of wanted to get on and maybe go back to your original premise, the techno-optimism. What are some of the major assumptions that are underpinning this hypothesis that we're actually in an age of abundance and techno-optimism? If you could drill into some of the major points, and then we can kind of maybe debate them as you go.
Sure. Let me start with the income chart that I was on and see if I can figure out. Yeah, thank you. And let's just take a look at this. If you make the usual economist assumption that people are worth what you pay them, incomes have been rising at a remarkably steady 1.8% a year in the United States since the beginning of the country's existence. And it started out at 2,000 or 3,000. Now it's about 68,000. The growth rate has tailed off recently, but it tailed off a few other times. In the 1930s, it went negative, and then right after World War II, it grew at about the same rate it is now, tailed off, and then we went through a couple of other rough patches. And so, but what's more important is the world. The world is growing like the United States did, and that has also gone back to about 1850 to 75. And this sharp rise toward the end here is China, India, at the beginning of the period, it was Southern Europe, places like that. So there seems to be a natural growth rate of, it's not natural in the sense that it happens all by itself. It happens because people work hard to get their standard of living to be a little better next year than it is this year. And it requires capital. It requires peace so that you're not destroying capital by blowing things up. And it requires human capital, which is education and ambition and training and so forth. And nothing's really changed here. We went from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy in this period, a little earlier, had tremendous growth. We went from an industrial to let's call it an information-based economy in this period, had tremendous growth, and now we're in a little bit of a rut. But I actually think that this understates the rate of growth in the 21st century, because if you figure that the goods and services in the economy are worth what you pay for them, then anything that helps save money and do things more cheaply comes out of the GDP measure, even if it's an increase in the quality of life. A 2021 car is so much better than a 1971 car that you can hardly compare them.
So you're making the case for the hedonic adjustments that are sometimes criticized in CPI calculations. So maybe we can dig a little bit into this general framework for justifying this optimism. So you're starting off with,
they actually underdo the hedonic adjustment. How do you compare the value of riding a horse with the value of driving a car? You can't, so they make something up. How do you compare the value of having a computer that's the size of an office building with the value of a computer that you carry around in your pocket that's 100,000 times as powerful? You can't, so you make something up. Marty, not Leibowitz, I'm trying to think of his name. Marty Feldstein, the one-time chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, wrote a series of papers shortly before he died on this. He concluded that we were underestimating the hedonic increase because you're putting something into the market basket after the improvement is over. That we put cars into the market basket in 1935 when cars were already really good. And the big gain was from 1895 to 1935, and none of that made it into the adjustments to the CPI. Instead, what you got was the rising price of horses. And then we put this.
So in fact, are you arguing that the rate of growth of the income per capita is not linear, but rather it's
even higher,
exponential?
No, it's log linear. 1.8 a year.
That's a log linear chart, right? So
that's a log linear chart, and it's not.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that the slope of the line should be just a little higher, especially in periods of dramatic transitions in technology, such as the early 21st century. And if we're, other than me, we look like a fairly young crowd here. If you remember back to how you grew up, my family had one car. It was a beat-up old Ford. My father thought he was middle class. The house that we grew up in, you can't even give away now. It's what's called in the United States a HUD house, which is a house that the government buys in order to give to some poor family. And it was built to house workers, but now it houses non-workers. And if you want to house a worker, you have to build a 2,400 square foot house or you won't be able to. It's not only you won't be able to sell it, you won't be allowed to build it because that's the minimum building code in a lot of these suburban developments. Now, some people live in condos, which are smaller, which could be smaller, and so we've moved from the starter house is a rented apartment to the starter house is a condo. Not really a big shift, but young millennial people looking for housing up where I live, they want to buy a last house when they're 35 years old or 40 years old. I don't think that most people did that 2 generations ago when I was a kid. So the standard of living has taken a big leap upward, and we were barely even aware of it.
Do we get to some sort of peak housing, if you will, in the fewer argument, or as we get fewer and fewer people? As you say, it was a small home. You had one home. Today, people have a home. It's much larger in square foot per person. Then they also have a cottage, and they might even have a second home. And so,
we're going to need less housing.
Yeah, it seems to me if we go fewer, and what's the reflexive impact on sort of capitalism as a whole for the fewer aspect of the way you approach the book?
Well, that's a fair question. A decline in the price of something doesn't affect capitalism one way or another. Capitalism is the idea that if you produce a resource, it's yours. And if the price goes down, you will have a lower income because capital gains and losses are additive to income. And then the person who buys it from you will have a higher income because it will cost them less to live. So as we transition from baby boomers owning most of the good housing to a smaller, younger population owning most of the good housing because I won't need it anymore, we should expect real estate to not appreciate and possibly decline substantially in areas where it's overbuilt. And now that we're all working from home, we think that's forever. Companies haven't yet begun to fully appreciate the cost of no social interaction at the office or conferences or meetings. But you don't discover new ideas or figure out new ways to do things when you sit at home and complete a series of tasks that you've been given by your boss. You do that through serendipity. and to two engineers standing over a computer and saying, I wouldn't do it this way, I would do it that other way, or two car mechanics, or two people who are working on the insides of somebody's anatomy at the hospital. We seriously underestimate the value of collaborative work. So I think that we could have a productivity problem in the short run, because everyone thinks they're working as hard as they can, but they're not working on the innovative part. And innovation is the only thing that makes the economy grow, because if you do what you did yesterday exactly the same way, it may be a very decent standard of living, but you have a growth rate of 0. You have to do a little better the next day.
I think implied in Mike's question is a broader issue with what has been described by some as embedded growth obligations, right? Not only in the real estate market, but also in the stock market. The system itself is somewhat predicated in the idea of growth, and the value of assets is sort of held in addition to liquidity, obviously, but this idea that the economy is going to continue to grow, demand is going to continue to grow, and that's why assets are going to continue to appreciate. The issue then becomes when you have a transition period between one and the other. So I guess the possible pain or the likely pain, virtual certainty through this transition period. How do you see that kind of playing out from the current environment to this sort of techno-utopian scenario that you're painting?
Well, I think that if you're counting on in conventional investment portfolios growing at real 7, they're not going to. And there may be a period in the more distant future when they do again, and that'll depend on a technological transition that we can't yet foresee. But at current prices, growing at real 7 is just about mathematically impossible. So you should budget for lower rates of return. Does that mean that the economy is going to stop growing? I don't think so, because we're looking at per capita numbers on these charts. And if the rate of growth of the population is lower, the rate of growth of the economy can be lower, and you still get the same improvement per capita. Is there a threat to capitalism itself, which is simply the freedom to keep the fruits of your own labor and reinvest them? Only if the socialists take over because they want your money. There's no logical connection between population growth and capitalism, or even between economic growth and capitalism. If stocks all paid a 7% dividend and had 0 capital gains, how would that be different from stocks all growing in price at 7% a year and paying 0 dividends? What the engine of market returns is related to economic growth, but it isn't dependent on economic growth. Look at value stocks. On the long run, growth stocks and value stocks have had the same return. Value stocks are old economy, shrinking markets, and so forth, and growth stocks are new economy, growing markets, and yet because of what we call valuation, because the value stocks are cheap, you can make just as much money, not this decade, but on average over time, in the value as in the growth sector. So I'm not really answering the question. I don't have a completely developed theory of growth that transfers through to investment markets, and neither does anyone else, by the way. But I read about it a lot, and we've had other periods where we faced a lot of problems, and our standard of living is so much higher than it was then. I'm thinking of the 70s, the 30s, the 1880s and 90s. These were all periods of tremendous technical innovation, and yet the markets didn't go up, and the GDP data didn't look so good. So I would.
Interesting. So what's underlying that?
Part of it is just pricing. after a huge bull market, the bull market is either a forecast that the economy will catch up to the market prices, or that the market prices will catch up to the economy by going down. And we haven't had a good bear market in a while. When I say a good bear market, I don't mean a crash like March of 2020. I mean one where the excesses are really run out. Start out, and you're right. You start a new bull market after that with different stocks.
Yeah. No, but I'm thinking of even going back through time in history, in some of the centuries past, where we had huge technical revolutions. But I thought you might be referring to the GDP of those times, and in fact that there was no GDP increase necessarily, but there was, the increase in standard of living across the board. And so, is it a mistake in the measurement? Is it how is that happening?
Yeah, it's a mistake in the measurement. The most important industrial revolution was the second industrial revolution, the one that was cars and airplanes, electrical appliances, radio and so forth, roughly 1870 to 1930. And the GDP went up, but it didn't go up by a ratio that implied that made clear the changes in the standard of living over that time. In 1870, the majority of Americans, and I presume Canadians, busted their asses all day on a farm, and had life expectancies around 50, and their wives stayed home and cooked for huge families. My grandmother-in-law, my wife's grandmother, had 15 children, which if you multiply by the number of meals in a day and the number of children and adults in the family, meant that she was cooking 353 meals a week. And they did not live near a grocery store, nor did they have the money to buy anything at a grocery store. They got it off the farm.
It's a good workforce to have on the farm too, as a guy who grew up on a farm.
They had a workforce, and then other people had farms that grew other substances, and so they didn't just have to eat literally what they grew, but it was a small, self-contained economy. And you didn't expect to live very long or have a lot of leisure while you were doing it. And by 1930, we had an essentially modern economy. And people lived so much better that it's kind of hard to even describe that change. In 1870, you couldn't call your mother unless she was in the next room. And neither could the king of England, well, it was a queen, neither could the Queen of England. By 1930, everybody was doing it, and they were getting in their cars. Not literally everyone had a car, but almost everyone could pick up their groceries in a car and visit somebody halfway across the country by taking a drive. So we're not experiencing changes of that magnitude now, and we shouldn't expect the kinds of market returns that we got over that period. This Ibbotson / Jeremy Siegel, both of them are friends of mine. Roger Ibbotson is a very good friend. Real 7 is taken from a period when we had hypergrowth, and in the most successful countries in the world, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. If you look at Russia was a growth stock in 1900. Germany was the biggest growth stock in 1900, frankly. Well, they blew themselves up. Russia through communism, Germany by losing wars. So the expected return in 1900 couldn't have been real 7 because the realized return on the winners was real 7. So the expected return had to have been lower because you had big losers. Japan, a country like Argentina, which didn't experience a collapse, but it just had a bad rate of return. So we're expecting too much out of markets if we think that we're going to save 10 or 15% of our incomes and it's going to make us rich. We'll have to work longer, save more, and hopefully not consume less, but if we don't work longer and save more, then we do have to consume less because it's an accounting identity. Stuff out equals stuff in plus return.
But stepping
I guess to some point though, just one more, Rich, like you with expanding lifespans, expanding healthy lifespans, you do have the opportunity to work for a much longer period of time and take advantage of the compounding as well. So I mean, it's, I think we're in a bygone era of retiring at 65, when most are healthy enough to work till 72 or 73 or 75. And, that goes a long way to solving that issue. Anyway, I'm sorry to jump in there, Richard. Go ahead.
That's great. That brings up an issue I wanted to bring up, but didn't think I could squeeze into an hour. I have a paper coming out called Work Longer, and it is basically says you get a double benefit out of it. Not only do you make more money, but you have fewer years to pay for with the money you've saved. And our health span isn't expanding as fast as our lifespan, especially if you're in right now it's become fashionable to tell young people, don't go to college, learn a trade. But what are you going to do after 55? They can't all be the boss. And you don't want an 81-year-old roofer on your roof.
That's true.
So we can't all work to 75, but a lot of us can. I'm getting there. I'm 67, but I've had to cut back a little because I don't quite have the desire. I have absolutely no desire to have a full-time job and a boss and a paycheck. I'm self-employed. I take what comes in over the transom, and so far I've been successful at it. But I modesty aside, I'm not a person of average ability. And a person of average ability may have to do something that's quite uncomfortable for people over 65 or frankly over 55. I'm not sure I want a roofer who's over 55.
But Larry, putting aside for a second the expectation of markets and staying within the realm of the economic expectations and sort of this age of abundance, I've heard some what I would describe as straw man criticism of this idea of techno-optimism that has been put forward by you and guys like Steven Pinker as well. And a lot of that skepticism of that thesis would come from the idea that we're hardwired to focus on the overly negative. It's made evident in the news flow. If it bleeds, it leads, and all that stuff. So right. Putting that straw man version aside, what are some of the biggest challenges to your hypothesis of abundance? What are some of the variables that you're watching for that would make you rethink and reassess your hypothesis for the optimism that you put forth?
One, half of the population is below average. This economy seems to be set up as a war between the smart and the stupid, where the smart won. The tax rates that would be necessary to support half the population would be unbelievable and very damaging to incentives. And if half the population is sitting around collecting benefits, they become dangerous. I'm going to stop there because because it's 3:56. I guess 4:56.
So we don't have a hard stop at the top of the hour unless you do.
No, not at all. But people's patience wears thin after an hour.
Well, it's just for us. It's just the four of us. So
okay.
If they want to leave, they can leave and come back and listen.
Or they can fast forward later when they watch listen to the recording. So that's not no bother.
Let's call time at 5:15.
Okay.
It's another worry is if our environmental costs turn out to be much larger than the standard model. The standard model is 200 million people are going to have to move uphill, but it's going to take half a century to a century for that to play out. Certain parts of the Middle East and South Asia may become too hot to support agriculture, but Russia and Canada are going to do great. William Nordhaus won a Nobel Prize for calculating these environmental costs, and it's 6 or 7% of global GDP, or a couple of years' growth. So we'll be as well off in 2102 as we would have in 2100 without the environmental costs. Well, if that's off by a factor of 50, that's something to really worry about. I don't think it is, but we haven't begun to fight this war. We don't have any nuclear plants to substitute for coal and oil and the oil in our cars. We're building electric cars like maniacs, but we're not building any way to power the cars. So we will.
Larry, have you looked into Nordhaus's seminal papers? And
not enough detail to criticize. Yeah. I've only read the more or less the top layer.
Because Steve Keen is a bit of an expert in Nordhaus's methods, and because of his assertions, I went a ways down the rabbit hole, and I found it surprising that their models are based on cross-sectional data, which evaluates the difference in productivity between what is observed, for example, in New York or at New York latitude versus Florida at Florida latitude. And so observing that productivity in Florida is X percent lower than the productivity in New York, and the average temperature in Florida is X percent higher than the average temperature in New York, and then extrapolating this to assume that if the average temperature in New York becomes the same as the average temperature in Miami, that this will only have a difference equal to the difference in productivity between those two. Now, of course, if you have
it's more 10%. Yeah.
Well, if you have a 10% average temperature difference, then half the current above sea level land will be underwater, and there'll be such mass migration and displacement that the world's economy will be unrecognizable. So I think going all the way back to Nordhaus's assumptions, and I know as I look through the IPCC documents and so much of the research from that time takes Nordhaus's models as being
gospel.
I just think it's worth sort of digging into those models more closely, and then if those models are off by a factor of 10 or a factor of 50, or if the models are much more nonlinear in effect than Nordhaus assumed a linear model, right? If they're in fact nonlinear instead of linear, then obviously the impacts are going to be much more substantial than he.
Right. Well, I mean, I agree. The world is only so big. If New York becomes Florida and Florida becomes Manaus, Brazil, then what becomes New York? Well, it's somewhere in Labrador. And the resources to support a population of 28 million or whatever the New York metropolitan area is don't exist in Labrador. And eventually you get a turn down in productivity much sharper than Nordhaus would be projecting using that model. However, not absolutely none of the this land disappearance that's been predicted by the standard model has actually occurred. The southern Louisiana, which is where it's most obvious, wasn't productive land in the first place because it was under about 1 foot of water, and now it's it's a foot every century and a half. So now it's under about 2.5 feet of water. That's good for alligators, but it doesn't affect our GDP very much because they weren't producing any. We looked at the Mekong Delta, and the amount of land loss is 1 or 2%. The entire Mekong Delta would disappear if the ice caps melted. But that's a pretty extreme forecast if the rise in sea levels of a foot every century and a half were to double or triple, you still wouldn't lose the Mekong Delta or the other large population area which is threatened, which is Bangladesh. You might lose a piece of Miami because the geniuses in Florida built it on land that was 5 feet below sea level. In New Orleans, they have dikes to keep the water out, but in Florida, they have hopes and dreams.
Yeah, fair enough. And by the way, I didn't want to derail it, but it's just interesting. It's
Yeah,
sort
but
of think
it's
about
more interesting than going
how
through
different
a bunch of
models.
data slides. I'm not going to go back to the presentation if we can have an open conversation like this. Let me go back just to see if there's anything worth bringing into the conversation. Though I need to. That's not. I need to find it. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. This has to do with past improvement in health, food, and so forth, and life expectancy. I'm just going to skip it. Go to greener. There's your greener topic slide. Air pollution has all but disappeared in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and it moved to China and India. Sulfur dioxide has all but disappeared in London, as has smoke. The reforestation of Europe is made visible by this GIF. Looks like we're going the right direction here, even though the population of Europe has grown tremendously since 1900. They moved to the cities and aren't digging up the whole countryside to grow food. But yeah, let's look at what we would actually do to deal with our environmental challenges. One is build nuclear reactors. This is a molten salt reactor. A very popular topic of discussion right now, although it was invented as a concept. And I don't think they built one in the 1950s, when the idea of if a nuclear plant's biggest risk is a meltdown, why don't we build one that's already melted down? And it turns out molten salt melts at a high enough temperature to absorb the heat from a nuclear reaction and then drive a turbine, a water-based turbine. And this is now on the drawing board for the revival of the nuclear age, that we were all going to have electricity that was too cheap to meter 50 years ago or 75 years ago. And now we're going to try to get back on the horse by convincing people that Chernobyl was quasi-intentional. 3 Mile Island didn't kill anybody, and Fukushima had to do with placing a nuclear reactor on an earthquake fault that's also on the ocean. and very few people died there too. But a lot of people died digging coal out of the ground or transporting coal or oil by truck and train. This is a thing designed like a Socotra Island dragon tree, just to look pretty on the streets of Boston, for sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. And this is an expensive, nuclear energy intensive way of getting rid of the carbon dioxide that we've already put in the air, plus the carbon dioxide that we're going to put in. There are other ways. There are various projects being funded mostly by billionaires, some by some foundations and governments, for carbon sequestration. Put it back in the ground. Getting the carbon out of the air and putting it back in the ground is expensive, but it's more expensive for us to all boil away. And then the last line of defense we have, and I don't like any of the ones on top here, but you could put sunglasses on the earth, with space mirrors. There was a cuckoo plan that I read about in one of Stuart Brandon's books. He's a dreamer. 18 trillion butterfly-shaped and sized space mirrors in orbit in the R1 point or G1 point. I'm not a physicist here.
Between the Earth and the Moon, or
no, between the Earth and the Sun.
The Sun, yeah.
Yeah, the Moon doesn't heat us up. Between the Earth and the Sun, in a place that would reduce the solar radiation reaching the Earth by 2%. What could possibly go wrong?
Oh my God! Yeah, the unintended consequences.
Some of my talks, I put a mastodon standing on an ice floe, and I say, this is what could possibly go wrong. Why don't we cure the global warming by starting a new ice age? Where I am sitting, it was under 2 miles of ice only 18,000 years ago, and it could be again. It could be again if we do nothing. We're clearly between two ice ages, and the only question is how hot it's going to get. So
I guess the real question is the duration of the transition period and how much pain is going to be inflicted on the general populace, right? Because I guess the evolution of technology is inexorable. It's going to happen. As you mentioned, there's so many different avenues for improvement and for our ability to terramorph and improve geoengineering and our ability for carbon capture and all that. But how long will it take till we can do this at scale? And what are some of the costs that we might all be inflicted with in the coming decades, if in fact the worst fears from climate change are true?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that you want this to happen as slowly as possible, but we don't control that. What we do control is how quickly we adapt and how quickly we put into place mitigation technologies, some of which I've gone over, but the easy ones everyone knows, which is to emit less CO2. If that is the critical variable, we also hear that methane and water vapor are critical variables, that fluctuations in the radiation reaching the Earth from the sun is a critical variable because we had the sun is a slightly variable star. We just had a low solar activity period. The Earth did start to cool a little bit for a few years and then got hot again pretty quickly. So I'm not an environmental scientist, and there are so many moving parts that even the best environmental scientists can't seem to keep them all straight in their heads at once. Each one specializes in something different.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the main concern would be that however slim the possibility for that worst case scenario, the negative outcome would be so large that one would have to contend with it in the sort of layering out of the probabilities and sort of the mitigation. But to touch upon the point you were raising earlier, what are some of the incentives that you see that we might be able to put into place on the nearer term to help drive us towards some of these improvements in habits and behaviors that would lead us to a better outcome?
Well, a lot of people have talked about a carbon tax. I'm not against it, but how big would the tax have to be for people to cut their carbon use to a level that really helps the environment? Well, for $30 a gallon gas would get a lot done, but it would create a second Great Depression 10 times as bad as the first one. A lot of people would starve. Productivity would fall to near zero in areas that require a lot of transportation because we don't have the zero emission transportation in place. We've already got $5 a gallon gas, and it isn't getting rid of the problem. And although people are buying more electric cars and they're driving less, they're partly driving less because there's nowhere to go. You don't have to drive to work. You can just walk over with a cup of coffee and your shorts and go to work. You're going to see a decline in miles driven. Now, we were seeing a decline in miles driven before that, but it's not enough. And in China and India and Africa, that they don't need less energy, they need more energy. There are still people living in Africa who spend 4 hours a day collecting sticks to burn in unvented huts, or where they poison themselves with carbon monoxide. You do not want to tell them to stop using energy. You want to provide them with sources of clean, safe energy. And that's being done. Electrification in Africa is taking place at an incredible rate, faster than anything we ever did here during the Rural Electrification Administration in the United States, because they need it more than we do. And it is, as we reduce our first world energy usage, they're going to continue to increase theirs. And so I see nuclear power as being critical. We're using 1.5 petawatts as a human race, using 1.5 petawatts of electricity per hour. For everyone to live at the level of the poorest first world country, which is Portugal, we need 5 petawatts globally. So we need to just a little more than triple. We're not going to do that with wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, unless we work on it for 300 years. We need the nuclear, and we need every source of power we can get. We need cleaner burning fossil fuels, because CO2 isn't the only emission that you should care about.
Are you optimistic on the mass deployment of nuclear?
I don't know. Having watched the COVID epidemic unfold, I'm not optimistic that people are doing what's best for themselves, even when the incentives are laid out right in front of them. But we've got a population here which is 75 or 78% of adults have had at least one dose of the vaccine. Well, the other 25% are 75 million people. And some large percentage of them are going to get sick and keep, I can say, well, I don't care about them, although I do, but people do. But even if you didn't care whether they got sick or not, they're going to keep the economy from reopening in full. So people.
They also may deprive those who are vaccinated from healthcare on other issues.
Yes,
by overcrowding the healthcare system as it is. So.
Yeah, by consuming all the health.
Yeah, numerous knock-on effects that people tend to overlook.
Yeah. So, do I think that people will get used to nuclear plants in every city, small to medium-sized, standardized, so that you only have to train one group of nuclear engineers and fly them to the nuclear plant that needs a repair instead of having a custom design for each one? Well, the French have done it. I don't think that the French is particularly rational. With them in Canada.
They make some good food and wine, though.
They make
Maybe that's what it takes.
Our Americans are getting their Food and Wine Act together faster than we're getting our Energy Act together.
That's true.
There's now like some type of gastropub in every little city, and all 50 states have wineries, including Alaska.
Alaska has a winery?
Yes.
Okay, that I didn't know.
Southern Alaska has a climate very much like British Columbia, and surprisingly warm. But it's I think they have a winery because somebody told them you're not a real state unless you have a winery.
The question is, do they have a gastropub?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's good food. In
I
Alaska.
think it's fitting to end on that note of optimism, which is that there's now a gastropub in every city, and a winery
And a winery in every 50 states. In the US
I
state.
think so, and you will find me in one of them.
I will keep my eye out.
Wining and dining quite comfortably, and encouraging people to look for solutions instead of despair that there aren't any.
It's a great way to end it.
Well, thank you. I hope you send me a URL so I can publicize this to all of my friends and my readers,
Yeah, I'm sure.
and that it'll remain up for a while, because some of them have a long back list of stuff they want to look at.
And where can people find you, Larry? Are you on any other social medias? We've mentioned the book. Are there any other projects that are coming on the horizon apart from the paper that you mentioned that you want to mention?
Yeah, I'd love to actually advertise the fact. I'm not going to hold up a copy, but I have to walk in another room to do that. But I have a second book. It's called Unknown Knowns. The subtitle is On Economics, Investing, Progress, and Folly. And it's a collection of my articles from the last 10 years. And it's available on Amazon. Just type in Unknown Knowns. Not Known Unknowns. That's the Donald
It's another
Trump
guy.
with the other guy. And then my website is LarrySiegel.org. And everything I've ever done is on it. So it's spelled like you see on your screen. Larry the customary way, and Siegel the old German way, not any of these newfangled SCGAL things. It's SIEGEL.org. And my email address is on the website. If you want to write to me, it's a little complicated, but you just find it there. And thank you for your time, and thank you in advance if you buy one of my books.
Thanks, Larry.
Thanks for
so
joining
much
us.
for showing up and for sharing and for being a good sport.
Well, you guys
And,
are great interviewers. You actually ask tough questions, and when I say I don't know something, you accept no for an answer. That's different, and I very much appreciate it.
It's good to hear. Thank you.
We
Yes,
appreciate you as
that.
well. Thank
Thanks,
Have a
guys.
great weekend, all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
stay in
Cue the
touch.
music, Connie.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Resolve Asset Management Inc.'s separately managed accounts, available for U.S. and Canadian investors. While diversification is often discussed, it is important that it actually be delivered. Through the suite of Resolve global mandates offered at varying risk levels, we aim to strike the balance between global diversification, appropriate risk balance, and directional alpha. Our portfolios are designed to safeguard and profit across many economic regimes, including periods of negative growth shocks or unexpected rising inflation, periods in which, in our view, the traditional 60-40 portfolios may fail to deliver adequate returns for investors. Resolve to improve your portfolio. Click on the link in the description to reach out to a representative and assess which Resolve mandate is right for you.